All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Father Jeffrey Langan, is the chaplain of the Metro Achievement Program in Chicago, ordained a priest in 2015. Before that, from 2001 to 2012, he was a professor of political philosophy and liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College. He has published books and articles on the French Revolution, contemporary geopolitics, and the role of Platonic philosophy in contemporary Iran. As many of you know, tonight's topic is the philosophical context for the understanding of the Epstein files. Provided you read the material from the Corbett Report and the excerpt from Book 2 of Plato's Republic, you should have a good idea of where this is headed this evening. Let's note that Plato warned us that leaving the cave can be uncomfortable, so consider tonight a brief adjustment to the sunlight. Want to take it away, Father John?
Great, thanks, Seamus. So, as I was preparing the talk, I think Book 2 of the Republic, the introduction to Book 2 of the Republic, gives us some seminal categories for how to think about politics. And before I go into Book 2, I just want to give a little bit of like the background. So first of all, why am I speaking to you as a priest? Well, before I was a priest, I was a political philosopher. And both priests and political philosophers are interested in the principles that should guide human behavior. Obviously, as a priest, we get our principles that guide human behavior from Revelation, ultimately, and then as given to us by the church. And clearly, one idea that comes to us from Revelation through the church to our own time is justice. Right, giving justice, the basic definition of justice would be giving to each his due. Now, what each is and what is due, that can be a matter of a large debate. But also, as a political philosopher, right, Plato's Republic is about justice. Right? Primarily, it's about justice. And the first two books are the Book 1 and Book 2 of the Republic are kind of a setup of a discussion about justice. And precisely it's the question of justice that gets the discussion going all the way from Book 2 through the rest of the book. I think it's also interesting that the title of the Republic is precisely, in Greek, the word is politeia. And what politeia, what it means maybe more in English would be the regime. And the regime could be the kind of regime. So a republic could be one kind of many different kinds of regimes. So in a sense, the title in English of the Republic is kind of an approximation, but it's not a full, it doesn't give you like a full sense of even just the title of the book. Because you could have, regime could mean, what's your system of laws, education, customs? Who are the great men, or who are the important men that make up the various groups that influence law, custom, education, policy? So regime has a much broader meaning than just the word republic. As far as the title of the book itself. And I think ultimately, for Plato, republic, justice, is what binds together all the groups, all the persons, all the factions that make up a society. And that's also part of Catholic social teaching, right? That justice, St. Paul describes this, both in Ephesians and in Colossians. He gets to a point when he's describing the body, and he'll say the church, for example, it's the ligaments that hold everything. If you think of the church as a body, so you have muscles and bones and whatnot, right? What are the ligaments that hold everything together? All the different parts. Right? If it's justice and charity. So that's where there's this overlap, which I think is very important. Also, Catholic social teaching very much emphasizes justice, because why? It comes from Christ himself, that we should be concerned about, blessed are those who pursue justice, right? You can take one of the Beatitudes in that way. So I want to set up Book 2 of the Republic. And the best way to set up Book 2 of the Republic is to introduce you to the character from Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, Cleon. Right? Cleon was the most violent man in Athens, we're told. So the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, it is the book that recounts for us this great war that took place on the Greek peninsula, but also throughout the entire Mediterranean, between Athens on the one hand and Sparta on the other. And for the study of modern international relations, many of the British thinkers who kind of gave us modern international relations, they used Thucydides as the boilerplate. But basically saying that what Athens was in the ancient Mediterranean, England and then the United States will be in the modern world. And what Sparta was in the 1850s, 1860s, when they were thinking of Sparta, right? They would say, well, what will Sparta be in the modern world? Sparta will be either some combination of Germany and Russia, right? Sparta being the city on the land that had a great army. Athens being the democracy, but that became a kind of empire based on the rule of the sea. Right? Athens established a kind of economic empire throughout the Mediterranean based on control of the sea. So the great conflict between Athens and Sparta in the ancient world was Sparta had the land, the great army, the Marines. Athens had the Navy. And the theorists, some of the first theorists of international relations, they precisely proposed that what series of nations in the world would be like Athens: England, the United States, Australia, Japan, maybe South Africa, right? But we're talking about the 1850s into the early 1900s. They felt that some of those thinkers from the 1850s, early 1900s, they felt that the one thing you could never let happen would be a kind of union between, even a financial union or an economic union between Germany and Russia, because they could form an economy that would be independent of the English Empire. Right? That was kind of how they thought about things. So if you go back to the Peloponnesian War now, who is this Cleon, this character Cleon? So Thucydides recounts the history of this war between Athens and Sparta. The first great leader of Athens during the war, he died early on in the war. The war goes from more or less 430 BC to about 399 BC. That's the entire youth of Plato, by the way. So the Peloponnesian War is how he formed his mind, right, growing up. And the first great leader of Athens during the Peloponnesian War was Pericles. Most people, I don't think they realize this completely, but Pericles was a sophist, right? He didn't ultimately. The sophists were we spoke about the sophists last year in one of our evenings here. But basically, the sophists, if just a kind of quick summary of the sophists, they basically say there is no truth, there is no ultimate human nature, right? So what is education? Education is learning how to manipulate perception. Right? On the one hand, it could be bread and circus. On the other hand, it could be manipulation of fear, manipulation of perceptions. Ironically, for the sophists, given the time that we're in, the sophists felt that, well, one way you can manipulate perceptions is you have to create a great enemy, right? A great enemy that allows you to organize the society, all the different factions within your society, so they don't fight with each other. You organize them to fight against a common external enemy. And that common external enemy for the sophists was Iran, Persia at the time, right? Persia at the time. So Pericles was a sophist who, I like to think of him as a European. Like, he was a sophist with good manners. Right? Most European leaders that I've come across are nihilists with good manners. Right? They know what time to have lunch, they know what time to have dinner, proper way to serve appetizers. And they're very offended if you don't know that. But when you kind of dig beneath the surface, you get nihilism, basically. Whereas Americans tend to be nihilists with bad manners, right? And that's the kind of the distinction sometimes that you end up with. So, and actually that happened in Athens. There were different sophists. Pericles was the leader of the gentleman sophists. His successor was this fellow Nicias. Nicias was the general who basically led Athens to her greatest defeats in the time of the empire. But and I think this fellow Cleon, he wasn't exactly he hated the sophists probably also, but Thucydides gives him the title that within Athens, he was the most violent of the leaders of Athens. And there's a famous debate and where Cleon, this one little island, the Mytilenes, they wanted, not Milos. Milos is one debate that most people read in school, if they read Thucydides in school. But there's this other little island in the war between Athens and Sparta that wanted to remain neutral. And basically, they had this, once they took over Mytilene, there was a debate within Athens, should we kill everybody or not? And Cleon was the fellow that took the position, show no mercy. Right? Mercy is a sign of weakness. So we should show no mercy. We have a Secretary of Defense that kind of articulates the position of Cleon in his press conferences. And so, but that was Cleon, right? Show no mercy. And of course, Cleon hated Nicias. And Cleon led a faction that was opposed to the faction of Nicias. And also, which is eventually also opposed to another faction, the faction of Alcibiades. Right, so there's different, and I'm saying this on purpose to set up the Republic because Athens was a democracy, but the sophists felt that the best form of government was something that appeared to be a democracy. It had all the trappings of a democracy, but that really behind the scenes, the different oligarchic factions determined policy. Right? That policy was not ultimately determined by representatives of the people, right? That it was ultimately determined by the oligarchic factions that were operating with the sophists kind of behind the scenes in Athens. So Cleon is the most violent of men. And Cleon is the one that he really is pushing. You could imagine Cleon, though it's not attributed to him. But there's one famous line that most people, that when they hear Thucydides, they at least remember this line, right? Where, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Right? During one of the debates, where it's Athens versus this little island, another little island, and the island is trying to convince the Athenians, you should treat us with justice. And the Athenians basically say, well, there is no thing as justice, right? There's only the strong. And the strong impose their will on the weak, and the weak suffer what they must. And you can imagine Cleon saying that, right? Cleon, who's, again, not a sophist necessarily, but he would be the kind of person that would say, I don't like the sophists. I don't like Socrates, because he's a philosopher. Sophists are philosophers. All these debates about the truth and justice and goodness, they don't mean anything really. We should just, as strong men, impose our will and impose our traditions on people. Ultimately, I think there is a kind of philosophical agreement between the sophists and the people like Cleon in ancient Athens, and maybe in our own time. But they didn't like each other. They represented different factions. So when we get to the Republic, Plato writes the Republic sometime between 390 and 360 BC. So about 10 years, he starts his project of writing his books. One thing about Plato's books is you can actually read all of them. I taught a course once where we read all of Plato's works in one academic year. Right? It's kind of doable. It's kind of doable. So between 390 and his death, that Plato is working on all of these dialogues. Plato scholars will have their little debates about when he wrote what, or maybe he was working on all of them at the same time, because there seems to be an order to them. So, but the Republic is clearly about the soul, and it's about justice, because he wants to define what justice is, because that's how you evaluate the quality of someone's soul, and that's how you evaluate the quality of the relationships that exist between the different persons and groups that make up a society, and institutions that make up a society. It's how you evaluate the laws of a society. So in the first book of the Republic, most people will know that there's the famous debate in the first book of Republic between Thrasymachus on the one hand and Socrates on the other hand. And that debate starts because Socrates starts asking these young men about what is justice. And at one point, one of the positions of the young men, it's actually a position that when you listen to politicians speak oftentimes, and not just politicians, almost when you listen to anybody speak about political events, the fallback position of justice is the one that the young men articulate, and that Thrasymachus ends up kind of augmenting in the first book. And that's the position of justice is doing good to your friends and harming your enemies, right? That's the position that I think most people who think of things in a non-reflective way and just who respond viscerally to events, right? Just sometimes this is called a kind of tribalism, right? My tribe or my group, those are my friends. Justice is doing good for them. And I think a term that will get used is we have to act in our self-interest is a term that will oftentimes be used in that context. And then we identify our opponents, our opposition, our enemies, and so we don't do good to them, and we do good to our friends, our supporters, our base, whatever that might mean. It's within the context of going back and forth between that definition of justice and then Socrates presenting his own definition of justice, which is justice is giving to each his due. Giving what is due to each person, each group, each entity. That Thrasymachus steps in, and they have this famous debate back and forth. Thrasymachus basically says there's two primary areas of justice, politics and economics. And he presents this position in which he says that the unjust man, he knows how to set the terms of the contract so that he, the stronger man, always benefits. So when times are good, whether it's politics or economics, the strong man benefits, and the people or the many or the weaker, they end up helping out the strong man. And then when times go bad, the strong man or the unjust man knows how to break the contract to shift all of the blame, all of the responsibility, all of the risk onto the people or the weak man, and he still benefits. Right? So Thrasymachus presents that as the ideal, you might say, of justice. By the end of the first book, Thrasymachus is, as a representative of the sophists, he's humiliated. And he kind of either goes silent or he leaves. I think he goes silent, because there's one other moment in the Republic where he pipes up. So he's listening now the whole rest of the Republic. At least that's kind of the drama of it. But then in the beginning of book 2, and that's what we read today, these Adeimantus and Glaucon, these two young men that are part of the conversation, they respond to Socrates and they say, Socrates, we don't think that you fully that you fully really responded to the challenge of Thrasymachus. And we think there's actually even some better arguments than the arguments that Thrasymachus comes up with. And so we lay them out. So they lay them out. They lay out the 5 arguments why injustice is better than justice. And one of the arguments, basically they describe the crucifixion. Right? They don't, obviously this is 300 years before Christ, but they basically say the unjust man would know how to make the just man appear to be, or people would perceive him as unjust, and they would crucify him. and then the unjust man would get off scot-free. So, and then at the very end, after they give their 5 arguments for injustice, they say, Socrates, if there's no justice, then what should we do? If there's no justice, what we should do, and here, when the little proposal that they give, they actually quote, or they plagiarize, or there should be a footnote to the Peloponnesian War. I think in our day and age, right, they would accuse Plato of plagiarism because he didn't footnote it. But basically they say, because there's one place in the Peloponnesian War where Thucydides says, one of the reasons that Athens ultimately fell is that the factions within Athens, they began fighting so much with each other, the factions that were operating behind the scenes, right? They began fighting with each other so much that they essentially weakened and decimated Athens itself. So Athens kind of crumbled and couldn't respond to all of the external threats. And that's so precisely what Glaucon and Adeimantus say right at the end of these 5 pages that I gave you, is that if there's no justice, what should we do? We should just set up clubs. And these clubs should operate behind the scenes. And what these clubs should do is, and then they kind of describe and outline the sophistical approach to life, which is from behind the scenes, these clubs should influence theater, the military, politicians, I guess nowadays we'd say journalism, the world of business. From these clubs, we should influence all of those different environments and determine what justice is. And so that they adopt, well, what justice is just what's in our minds. It's not what's just. It's just the narratives that we create in our minds, right? So that we can exercise power. So I think that's a fundamental insight of Plato. It's a fundamental, I would say it's a fundamental sociological insight. And one of the themes that runs throughout the Republic that oftentimes doesn't get spoken of, because there's all sorts of interesting debates. I mean, the Republic it's the greatest work of political philosophy. There's so many debates within it. But one debate that's running throughout the Republic is that one of the principal threats against justice in any regime are the oligarchs, right? Are the wealthy men who set up clubs, let's call them clubs, or who create factions that operate outside of the political institutions, the official political institutions, outside of the laws. And from those clubs, they try to determine what justice is. And they try to define what human nature is. They try to define all of the relationships that exist in a society, and they try to bend policy to their own interest, right? Which is in the interest of power for them. And so I think those are the categories. That's the framework for understanding the Epstein files. Okay, so that's just that's like a 20-minute framework for understanding the Epstein files. Because, now by the way, in the Corbett report, our little article that I sent you, what he focuses on, but to his credit, he footnotes everything that there's a lot of footnotes, a lot of other sources that he's relying on there. He kind of just describes an outline, one sliver of the faction, one part of the faction that would make up the Epstein faction. Right? And I think ultimately Epstein was not he was an agent, right? He was the family that gets, so the oligarchic family, to be consistent here, the oligarchic family that gets mentioned the most in the Epstein files are the Rothschilds, right? And how did the Rothschilds become an oligarchic family? They were a banking family that essentially got wealthy funding both sides of the wars between England and France in the early 1800s. And after they became wealthy in that way, the head of the family had his 5 sons set up banks, and then had other members of the family set up banks in the 5 most important capitals of Europe, and then also eventually in New York City. And when I was in Rome, actually, in 2014, 2015, I met a fellow who worked for the Rothschilds. And so he knew the family traditions. He knew how they operated inside and out. And precisely, he had never read Plato's Republic, but it was interesting getting to know this guy a little bit, because he precisely said to me, people like me who have worked for the Rothschilds and who know the family well, they know that, like if you go to the Fortune 500, if you go to some magazine that lists the most wealthy people in the world, the Rothschilds will not be on that list, right? They're not a family that, the families that are really powerful, vying for this kind of oligarchic control that we're speaking about here in the Republic, they keep their money off the books, right? They know how to spread it around. They don't want to be on any of these lists for who's the most wealthy guy. Like they don't want to be Elon Musk, the guy who's known, like, I'm going to pass a certain amount of money publicly, people know that I have that money type thing. No, they don't want that at all. Why? Because they have agents that they enlist in, well, gaining influence. This whole group, another group that's mentioned in the files, the World Economic Forum, and again, the World Economic Forum itself was founded by wealthy European families who are not, so it's not just the Rothschilds, right? There's other wealthy European families that are like the Rothschilds, and they compete with the Rothschilds, right? They create factions. And this, he would say, I represent the Rothschilds, right? In certain moments with certain individuals. Now, again, these oligarchic groups, I think just as Plato was describing here, they try to influence all levels of society. Why? Because, especially if you're a banker, in finance, you can finance both sides of almost any conflict, whether it's a cultural conflict, whether it's a military conflict, right? And in financing both sides, you can also have an influence on whatever you think is your vision of the world and how it's going to advance. So part of this little Corbett Report article, he's working within this, and he mentions Peter Thiel as one of the guys that kind of got involved with Epstein. So the oligarchs, obviously, they don't always agree. Just as I was saying, Cleon didn't agree with Nicias. I mean, if you go back to some of these primordial characters, right? Nicias represented the gentleman, the sophist gentleman, one faction, the sophist gentleman. Cleon represented a more violent faction among the oligarchs. Alcibiades represented even another faction within Athens that were vying for power. If you read Polybius, his histories of the Roman and the Carthaginian wars, the rise of the empire, one of the things that Polybius describes and that whole history of the Roman, what becomes the Roman Empire, are the different factions that were vying for power, each in its own way claiming to represent the people or not, or this or that. So there can be, I don't think there's ever one uniform where you can say this family or this, like the Rothschilds control everything, right? They have their competitors. A family that became that thanks to Al Capone, right? A family in our own town that has become an oligarchic family is the Pritzkers. The Pritzkers were the lawyers who defended Capone when he was arrested back in the 30s and 40s. And he thanked them by giving them a hotel, building them a hotel from which they would continue to, now the Pritzkers are one of these families that you could say they're an oligarchic family. Penny Pritzker was on the board of Harvard. I became aware of her when I was there. Different ones have had positions, both in the Obama administration, and of course now we have our governor. So and these factions don't always agree with each other, and you can see. So, for example, one of the persons that this guy Corbett mentions in his article is Peter Thiel, and Corbett and one of the researchers he relies on a lot is Whitney Webb. Because Whitney Webb, before in 2019, 2020, she produced the book about the Epstein, about Epstein, called One Nation Under Blackmail, which goes into the Epstein network and the Rothschilds and Les Wexner, right? And her book, she wrote her book before the files came out, so there was already a lot of evidence out there that could be gathered about the Epstein network, even before these files were made public. When she wrote her book, one of the things that she shows is that one of the factions that's vying for influence behind the scenes is you might say the Peter Thiel faction, which is the technocratic faction, or basically that the idea being there that, the people that are coming out of Silicon Valley that are giving us ultimately AI and whatnot, they're producing the people like James Corbett and Whitney Webb would say, they're producing so many mechanisms using the internet, using Palantir, AI, the internet broadly understood, social media, right? That one of the dangers of that is that could be used as a kind of sophistical mechanism of controlling people's perceptions and controlling their lives, basically, in a way that the sophists of the ancient world could only dream of doing, in a much more sophisticated way than even the sophists of the ancient world. Again, one of the seminal problems that Plato sets up by Book 7 of the Republic is the cave. And what is the cave? The cave is people who are watching a screen, and the screen is determining their reality. And so the whole image of the cave is, and one of the problems that's suggested by the cave is that, how do you separate yourself from the screen and to start to see reality for what it is, as opposed to how it appears to be on the screen? So in the analogy of the cave, or the myth of the cave that Plato gives, right, people they're chained to a wall, and they're forced to look at the wall that has the shadows on it. And again, in the myth, the sophists are there in the background, casting the shadows on the wall that keep everybody focused on the shadows. Well, with computers, iPhones, and whatnot, right? Your perception. You're not handcuffed you're not chained to the wall. You hold it in front of you. Now again, so the technocratic elite, the concern of it, that people like Corbett and Whitney Webb would say, is that you essentially have a super oligarchic faction that is trying to engineer conflict in various ways in this world, so as to gain the control of the empire, in this case the United States, that Pericles could only dream of back in ancient Athens. And so I think the social dynamic that is set up in the Republic can be very helpful for understanding the kind of problems that the Epstein files propose. That because the Epstein files give us, I think they ultimately give us a kind of sociological insight into how an oligarchic faction works in the modern world, as opposed to in the Peloponnesian War. Though some of the fundamental relationships, I think, are very similar. And of course, the consideration of justice is also very similar. Now, in Thucydides, and one of the concerns that's also the backdrop of the Republic, is precisely how war is used to advance the empire. Right? The sophist felt that the sophist felt that clearly the Peloponnesian War was a terrible thing. Right? This fratricidal war between Athens and Sparta. Because you had Greek killing Greek, kind of like the Civil War. You had Americans killing Americans. And so the sophists proposed that, well, if there's no truth, you have to create the truth. You have to create a sense of justice. So they felt that, well, you use the mechanisms of the military, politics, education, storytelling, history, entertainment. You have to use the athletics even, right? You have to use that to create the perception of an enemy. And you have to create a myth. And the myth you have to create is that the gods gave us things that make us superior to every other nation in this world. They gave us our beautiful Greek language. They gave us our free political institutions. They gave us our superior military technology. And again, part of the sophist myth was we have to create a sense that the gods gave us a mission to give every other nation in the world all these gifts, our beautiful language, our superior technology, and our superior political institutions and culture. And so, but well, how do you propose that we live this out? Well, how do you expand it? You have to create an enemy that you get people to fear so much that the fear of that enemy allows you to expand your empire to other parts of the world, right? Because the question is not a question of justice for the sophists. It's a question of how do you justify your expansion? And you have to justify your expansion by basically manipulating perceptions, manipulating fears. Right? So you create a kind of fear that's so great that everybody gets on board with opposing that fear. And well, that becomes again, I think that just becomes the rationale of empires throughout history. I don't think that's a new concept. So clearly, I think part of the Epstein files also is how do we create a fusion of policies between the Epstein files show that if you go back to this primordial division of the world that was taken from Thucydides in the 1800s, right? On the one hand, you have England, the United States, South Africa, Japan, Australia, potentially, right? That's how the first theorists thought of it. The island nations, right? The island empire against any land empire. I think in the 1800s, again, they thought the potential land empire we have to prevent from happening is Russia and Germany. I think now, I would speculate now, the fear is you have to prevent some combination of Germany, Russia, and China from emerging, right, in a harmonious way. That would be the land empire for the theorists who think this way. So, actually, I saw a very helpful presentation. It was just last week at the University of Chicago by Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer is one of the great contemporary theorists of international relations or geopolitics. And he basically says when the Cold War ended, in 1990, when the Cold War ended, there have been three primary ways of viewing the world. Right? One way of viewing the world is the end of history. America is the great power. She triumphed over the Soviet Union, the evil empire, and now we're at when I was a graduate student in the 1990s, that was everybody was talking about in politics, the end of history, right? American liberalism will dominate the world forever, right? And then in the mid-90s, this professor at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, wrote this book, The Clash of Civilizations. And he said, I think ultimately it's kind of a sophistical work, right? Civilizations are defined by their religions, and the next century is going to be defined by fighting it out between the various religions of this world. And then Mearsheimer's theory was more a theory of, the world is made up of regional hegemonic powers, and ultimately what's going to happen in the world is not religious civilizational conflicts. Ultimately, the best way to understand conflict in the world is regional powers as they emerge. Can they negotiate their conflicts with each other without resorting to war or not, right? So Mearsheimer felt that we had to move away from this kind of Athens versus Sparta mentality in the world. And one of his books is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I think ultimately in that book, he's arguing, I don't know if we can escape it, right? The Athens versus Sparta paradigm. But he's trying to come up with ways to see if we could escape it. I think what the Epstein files show, looked from the standpoint of these paradigms, is that Epstein was part of a network between Washington, D.C., England, London, and Tel Aviv, which was basically trying to include Israel as part of the empire of the islands, the island empires. One of the ways that the British Empire grew is through supporting the Netherlands. In other words, through supporting a small nation that would be kind of whose identity would be through attaching itself to England in a sea of hostile nations. The sea of hostile nations would have been France, Prussia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Spain, right? Breaking them off from Spain. But so the idea of Israel from this international theory perspective would be you have a landing pad, a launch pad in a sea of hostile nations, just like the Netherlands was in previous ages. So it seems to me the Epstein files also show the series. There's a series of relationships that are established where Epstein himself gets incredible access to information that not even congressmen can get access to about policy, about military alliances, about networks that are being set up between these various capitals and the countries they represent, right? So it's also I think it's also an insight into that. And then, of course, the heinous crimes, obviously. But I think it gives us a kind of, there are other oligarchic factions in this world. So I don't want to say it's like one world to rule them all, like this is Sauron here, right? But it gives us an insight into how this particular oligarchic faction, which is very influential in Europe and the United States, how it operates on the level of finance, on the level of policy. So I'm going to stop there. That's about 40 minutes. I don't know if there's any comments, questions, lines of discussion that people might be interested in.
Who's Cleon right now?
Pete Hegseth.
Okay.
I mean, no, but literally, one of the positions that that Cleon is known for is he says, you give them no mercy. You show the civilian population no mercy. And if you follow his press conferences in the last 10 days, he has almost quoted exactly the position of Cleon from the Peloponnesian War. And of course, I didn't go into this so much, but I did give to you that just as far as Catholic social teaching, right? And I gave to you the statement from the cardinal, and then I gave you another statement from a Catholic philosopher on what is the criteria for evaluating a just war, whether a war is just or not. And this quote is like, it's so clear in the Catechism, right? That the quote of, you can't target civilians, right, in carrying out the war. You have to do everything you can to limit civilian casualties. And he's been, so obviously it's part of warfare has been to limit that pagan impulse of someone like Cleon, right? Of, yeah, just kill all the women and children, kill them all, right? Part of Christian just war theory, Catholic just war theory, as developed over the years, is precise, and again, it's taken centuries to develop this, but it's precisely, you do what you can to limit civilian casualties. And Hegseth doesn't even, that never seemed to register. It doesn't seem to be part of his mind, at least in his press conferences.
What are your thoughts on the phenomenon with the cultural reaction to the Epstein files? And I'll expand on that a little bit. So when after Epstein hung himself, it was the one side, the Republicans, who were calling that out as no, this, like, clearly didn't hang himself. Democrats, liberals did not really even care or want to even touch that story.
Right.
And then we kind of went through this weird period where it kind of quieted down, but there were people who kept pushing that charge of no, like, these victims need justice. And then now fast forward to maybe 6 months ago, all of a sudden you have all these the libs that are like jumping on and really pushing for the release of the files, and people who, like my wife and I were talking about this 6 years ago. Now we're seeing people who, aren't as they're more politically naive, who are really, really infatuated with this story. So I think the cultural public kind of reaction to what's going on, that the whole kind of trajectory of that is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, I think there's, if I could make a comparison to the 2002, 2003, 2004, when there was this whole explosion over the church not properly taking care of people who abused minors. Mm-hmm. I think in those days, there's two levels. One level is, how do politicians use it to get at each other, right? And how there were certain individuals how do you use that to get at the church, like because you have an axe to grind or something like that. But I think a lot of people, one of the realizations there in those days was that, these are serious injustices against the innocent. And that has to be rectified. And in the case of the church, some of the cardinals and whatnot that have had to deal with that, they've said, yeah, we failed to act in a way so as to defend the innocent. Right? We failed our responsibility. Now, we recognize that there was injustices against innocents. And I think that's I think the general population when they're presented with some of the behavior, the criminal behavior that's going on, what really I think unites everybody in a visceral way is this sense of injustice committed against the innocent, who got caught up in, right? That's, I think, what unites everybody. There's all sorts of other things that are going to be going on it's going to be politicians fighting with each other. We're going to expose you, we're going to expose you, right? But I think what really unites people and what gets their interest, especially as Americans, we want to see justice and we want transparency. We want these things to come out so that in a sense you can arrive at some level of justice in addressing the wrongs that were done. I think that's what unites everybody.
Do you think that the political naive people who are now all of a sudden passionate about this, or maybe passionate or at least engaged with this story, is it because the mainstream media or that oligarchic faction has kind of laid down, I remember there's a video of some news reporter who on air was going to bring up the Epstein, or she was mentioning something about Epstein. They cut her mic.
Yeah.
They fired her, and so it was there was a control on that story, and it almost seems like a reaction to, I don't know if it's just gotten so big, and there's been so much kind of these people who are really passionate about the justice for the youth,
right,
that are they're just not letting it die.
Well, yeah, because I think that there's something visceral about committing an injustice, a crime against someone who's innocent.
Yeah, but
right, so enough of that has come out.
Yeah, that point though was clear to us.
Right.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
And now it's almost like the media has decided, okay, let's just let this roll or something like that.
Yeah, because I think enough. Again, I think in the you look at the, there's always more groups tend to, whether you're talking about a football team, whether you're talking about a political faction or the Boy Scouts of America, all institutions tend to put up defensive walls when they're accused by the public of something. It's just I think it's a natural human tendency, a natural inclination. But when you put up these walls, if there's something that's visceral that gets out, and it's obvious to everybody, the people just start beating against the wall. And then the more you put the wall up, the more the people are going to hammer against it. Now, but the institution is going to do everything it can to protect itself. But sometimes in doing that, because a lot of times the oligarchic institutions, they know, well, eventually the people, there is this thing of the oligarchs versus the people, the few versus the many. And the few know that the interest of the people is not always going to stay the same, or that's one of their hopes, right? That eventually they'll go on to something else. Like you see this a lot when people they'll say, oh, they started the war to distract us from the Epstein files. And now they're saying, well, they're going to go back to the Epstein files to distract us from the war. I mean, you'll hear these kind of statements, right? Sure. Because why? Again, the few, historically, in the way politics works, right? The few are always looking for ways to, James Madison speaks about this. When they wrote our Constitution, they were trying to think this through. Right? The many, they can move from one thing to the next quickly because they seem to be more passionate. The few can take a stand and stick to it over time. That's one of the ways that factions work. And so the danger always is, for the few, is if the people get so focused on an issue that they don't let go of it. But I think what happens is when there's clear injustice that's visceral, right? That's where the people can become focused on it over time. Like I remember talking to this priest when everything broke loose in 2002, 2003. And this priest was a guy who was very sensitive to public opinion. And we were having lunch, And he said to me, he said, wow, this is like 25 years. This is going to affect the church for 25 years. The people won't give this up. I think he's right. Because why? It's a serious injustice.
Well, what about narrative being one thing, how they kind of seem to lose control a little bit?
Yeah.
You mentioned John Mearsheimer. I was in the invasion in 2003 of Iraq, and a lot of people were still in the dark because they had control of the narrative.
Right.
There was a lot of injustice there. I was a witness to it as a young man. I didn't start asking questions till I came home from my second deployment. I got out in 2006. I ran across Mearsheimer in maybe 2010 or 2011. His book, the Israel, Latvia, and U.S. Foreign Policy. And
This year's the 20th anniversary of that book.
So yeah, it's kind of, it started unraveling from there. But people, and you try to talk to people, they still didn't understand maybe what was going on then. And then it flashed forward to the article you mentioned, the Catholic philosopher one they shared about Iran, and I was there when, we made it up through Baghdad all the way up through Tikrit, and I watched what the civilian population did to each other in a very homogenous culture and country, and it was pretty violent, the fallout.
Right.
And so what's that going to look like in Iran with 92 million people? It's going to be even worse than that, and they don't have control of the narrative like they did back then.
Right.
So I think about that quite a bit.
One thing that's interesting about Iran is that, so I wrote a dissertation on Iran. Unlike Iraq, Iran has a poem that's a national poem that goes back to like 900 AD. The Spaniards have El Cid or Cervantes, and the Italians have the Divine Comedy. The British have Chaucer and Shakespeare. Well, the Iranians, they have this, I'm blanking on his name now, Fedorsky. It's like Fedor. It sounds Polish, but it's Ferdozi. Right, he wrote. It's the longest epic poem ever written, and it's written in Farsi. And it's written about 200 or 300 years after the foundation of Islam. And there's not one Arabic word in it. It's all Farsi. It's the national poem of Iran. And I think that Iran has more of a... Now, again, there's always oligarchic factions. And in chaos, they can always come out and start fighting with each other. I think that's essentially what happens when one of the things that the state does, right? A state moderates the violent conflict between factions. So that's why the mafia appears. When the state breaks down, the mafia appears. Or guerrilla militias appear when the state breaks down. So like what happened in Spain during the Napoleonic era, or in many Latin American countries, when the state crumbled, tribes basically, violent tribes, we call them gangs, reemerged. That's what happened in Italy that's how the mafia came to be in Italy. St. Augustine says one of the dangers of the empire is that a criminal group basically just takes over the empire and runs it in its criminal interests. Right? That's corruption in the empire, which that can happen. But so I think in Iran, and it could be that the Iranians have a much deeper sense of attachment to their state than the Iraqis did. Because Iraq was kind of cobbled together as a colony after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But Iran, it really developed as a state in the 16th, 17th century. The Safavid family really brought Iran together as a state and has had 2 or 3 centuries of cultivating its national identity. There are groups, right? I'll be the first to admit, yes, there are groups that could, and like Baluchistan. I mean, there are different ethnic groups, and the Baluchistanis, the Kurdish, right? And these families that are the ruling families in Iran they don't always agree with each other. Some of them are more secular, some of them are more religious. So they could break off. But I think there's a stronger state identity. And I think also now, and when I studied Iran, the people that I got to know and I talked with that wanted to change the system, they would always say the same thing. The best thing you could do if you want Iran to change is leave us alone. Right? Because every time you pressure us in some way, everybody unites. I mean, it goes back to the ancient world, right? If you pressure in a certain way, everyone will unite. And I think in Iran that'll happen more so than in, let's say, Syria or Iraq, because they just have a longer history of being a state. And they have a national poem that everybody still reads and identifies with. There's this one observer of international relations I follow. He 2 months ago, let's say, he was arguing that you could maybe divide, if you went into the right places, you could maybe divide the country up by fostering these different factions. But now he's like, oh, if you could have done it 2 months ago, you can't do it now.
Kind of like how they were talking about, oh, we're going to arm the Kurds. The CIA is going to arm the Kurds. And
Yeah.
that got shut down immediately.
Right.
Like.
Because the Kurds in Iran are Shia. And they were so abused, and they have long memories. They were so abused by the Nixon administration and Carter that they don't trust Americans. The Kurds in Iran itself. So I think even when we were proposing the Kurds, we were proposing arming not the Iranian Kurds, but either the Iraqi or the Syrian Kurds, to see if maybe they could go in and maybe get the Iranian Kurds to join them or something like that. But then the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds says, we've been betrayed too many times by the Americans. We're not going to do it again.
I mean, it was on my second deployment in Iraq was mostly Iranian-funded militia fighting us.
Yeah. In Iraq.
In Iraq.
Yeah.
When I was in.
So because there are Shia in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. Hezbollah is Shia. What's interesting is that Shia Islam it's very Catholic actually. It's very the structure. You just a cheap way of understanding Islam is that the Sunnis are like the Protestants, and the Shia are like the Catholics. It's a kind of because the Shia has a hierarchy. They have saints, imams are like their saints, and if an Ayatollah has a certain reputation, they'll treat him like a saint, and they have no problem with that. They have shrines to their saintly Ayatollahs, and of course they have a supreme leader who's kind of like the Pope for them. But one of the things within Shia itself, they don't have sacraments, so it's a limited comparison, but I think it helps you to get but also within Shia itself, there are, just like, you have the Catholic, you have the Orthodox. Well, there are these little divisions within Shia itself. And so a lot of Iraqi Shia and Syrian Shia and Lebanese Shia, they don't accept the supreme leader as like the Pope. They're like the Orthodox. But ironically, the assassination of Khamenei has united all of the different schools within Shiism at this point. So they've expressed, even though, so like Iran, yes, there's cultural ties, but like the Iranians helping the Shia in Iraq, that would be like, I mean, if you theoretically imagine Roman Catholics helping the Orthodox in Ukraine, right? It's not likely to happen, but it can happen. Good. Well, we can move over to the kitchenette. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think with the Epstein files, it's kind of pulled the curtain back on like all of the oligarchical webs
Yeah.
That you reference, and it feels like for the first time, and common people are pretty aware
Right.
now. So I'm just curious. My thought goes to like what's going to be the fallout, or you talk about justice. Everyone wants to see justice.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I mean, the media's kind of tried to before this try to
Right.
form what our idea of justice is, or the people, the many.
yeah.
So what's going to be the effect of everyone knows
Yeah.
how it all works now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I think one thing you see happening is that the few, because Epstein obviously he was an oligarchic. He was dealing with the oligarchic factions, or we would say the few, right? Mm-hmm. And the few are protecting themselves. They're putting up walls as much as they can to protect themselves from it coming out. I think one question will be, are the factions, do they get to a point where they all unite to prevent and kind of to hold the line? Or will there be eventually, will they break up amongst themselves to force a kind of transparency and accountability? I think it's going to be very hard in our system to get accountability, because I think what might happen, what you see happening in some other places already, is that there will be scapegoating that goes on. You find someone who's a minor figure and you prosecute him so that people can, like, they direct their animus, like so in England right now, the prince who's the brother of the king, right? He's no longer a noble. Maybe he'll go to jail. Maybe he won't. There's going to be a trial against him, right? But I think what they'll try to do is they'll try to raise, if it gets to a point where the people have got enough of the politicians on their side, then they'll try to have trials, but trials that will be limited to a few like representative characters, but not the people we should string up. That's a bad way to put it.
Yeah.
But I think but the dynamic is going to, I think that usually in these cases, the dynamic is, I mean, let's face it, sad to say, the bishops from the mid 80s, I remember talking with this reporter. He said he was critical of the bishops and ultimately, but he said, look, both the reporters and the bishops knew in the mid 80s that there was a lack of responsibility on the part of the bishops who should have acted and didn't. I remember, so like my one graphic example on this is in 1993. I was in a room like this one with the Cardinal of Boston and a bunch of college students. And I was coming from the Midwest, but we were on the East Coast together, and he was having a get together with us. And all these guys that were in like Princeton and Harvard, he said, "Oh, ask me any question you want." And all these guys, this was 1993, all these guys were like, "This priest, Father Gauguin, he's a terrible guy. Like, he's a suspicious dude. Like, you got to do something about him." And there was like 5 or 6 different questions, really focusing on this one guy. And at one point, the cardinal said, "Okay, enough of the questions about this Father Gauguin. You guys, you're the kind of people that want to throw people out. My job here is to keep everybody in." That's how he kind of ended the discussion. And then actually, it's funny, the very next thing we talked about was immigration.
Oh, wow.
And what was also even funnier is that after he gave his little spiel on immigration, he turned to the guy to his left, who at the time was a 24-year-old law student. And he said, well, let's stop talking about me. Let's talk about you. What are you doing? And the guy said, well, I just got hired by ICE. I'm going to be a lawyer for ICE. But anyway, you fast forward 10 years. This cardinal has to leave the country to avoid prosecution. He ended up going to Rome, where he died. He died in Rome 20 years later. And the reason he had to go to Rome is that this Father Gauguin was one of the worst serial offenders, that this cardinal had been moving from place to place, not disciplining as he should. And the problem is, a part of the problem is that in the early 90s, this Father Gauguin, he was I remember being on a television show in the 90s, like one of these small little cable, like, shows that people watch at 4 a.m, like religious discussion type things. And I remember the guy from Boston who was on this little show with me, he was praising this Father Gauguin as like the leader of the progressives, like he's going to change the church, introduce all sorts of this, that, and the other thing. Like so part of the problem is that this Father Gauguin was also like the darling of the left, and he was the darling of the media in the 80s and 90s. He was their hero. He was the guy they would quote when they wanted to change the church, right? But they also knew, the media knew who he was. They knew what he was doing. They chose not to report it in the mid-80s. Why? Because they were waiting for their moment, right? Where they could go after the church in a bigger way. So it was very cynical. So eventually when they break the story because they were trying to pass gay marriage in Boston and Massachusetts. And they knew that this would discredit so in other words, they break the story on this cardinal's malfeasance during the debates on gay marriage because they knew this would discredit the cardinal. This would discredit the church in those public debates. And it did. But they didn't talk about it in the 80s when they knew about it either. Because why? They were waiting also for their right moment. So it's like so sometimes in these things it does take it can be the factions fighting with each other that leads the truth to come out. But usually, like in the case that I'm giving you now, it's kind of tragic in a way.
One last thing that I gathered from the Corbett Report article, in the military, they would call it human intelligence and signal intelligence.
Yeah.
In the realm of personal responsibility as Catholics, in order to be effective in the future, especially young Catholics, the way they are going to gather intelligence and blackmail, it seems to be moving signal. It's going to be electronic.
Right.
It's going to be
right.
What you're.
I think that's what. Right. That's.
What do you think?
Yeah, they're saying basically. Yeah, that's one of the main points of the article was, when you look at Epstein, you see that he was like a honeypot operation. That's the euphemism that's given, right? You catch people sinning, and then you use that to blackmail them, right? J. Edgar Hoover started that, and at least that was done to him. But then he learned from his own experience, and he used it against other politicians, right? And that's Robert Maxwell, who was Epstein's mentor. He taught Epstein how to do that. So what they're saying is that we're getting to a point where if they have access to you and to everything you're doing in your life that you do, things you buy, articles you look at, things you read, they can monitor all of that to use that against you. So they don't need impurity anymore to use that against you. They have other mechanisms now like one of the dangers of the technocracy, the use of technology, is that they can use that to control you. Like, for example, we're all going to use Venmo to help pay for this. Well, if they shut down your Venmo account because you said, like, if they see this video and they shut down my Venmo account, well, I don't have access to my money, right? I can't pay my bills, right? So I think that's what they're suggesting, is that precisely the danger of the tech bros is that they can use, if all the money is online, if all the money is electronic, if all of our life is electronic, they can use that to control you.
So Palantir has built data mining a profile on you. You decide to run for Senate as a 25-year-old. They have everything you've done on the internet.
Well, but also it's like what they did to the truckers during COVID in Canada. They shut down their bank accounts so they couldn't buy food, or so they couldn't get donations, right? So at that point, they can't live because they have the wrong ideas.
Right.
So the control is, it's not even through just like, I don't know, you subscribe to the wrong magazine online, right? It's not that even. It's just you just say the wrong thing and you're doing the wrong things, and they can shut down your livelihood.
The control grid.
Yeah.
What would you say is important for, say, through like living out your Catholic faith in stories, or, like you look at the Epstein story and the devil's fingerprints are all over it. It's diabolical from
Yeah.
the act and behavior from all the way through.
High to low.
High
Yeah.
to low.
Yeah.
And then even the story itself, it plays on your senses to want
Right.
to get infuriated and learn more,
Yeah.
you can get taken in by it. So what advice would you have us to protect us from
Well, I mean,
overindulging?
again, this is like why I think precisely like this is why I introduced it as, I think Plato presents us with problems. And when you understand it on that level, that enables you to do research with the spirit of study, to understand how these structures work, as opposed to just getting angry with this, that, or the other, terrible thing that happened. Right? So I think that precisely when you get categories that explain the larger, right? Because one of the dangers always is like that. Like I know a number of people, like you say Epstein files, and they roll their eyes. They're like, "Oh, I don't want to go there." Well, why? And I understand that, right? I just don't want to read stories, sensationalist stories about cannibalism, right? And that's understandable, right? Because you can get angry at that, and it can get you depressed, right? That people are this way, right? But that's where I think if you understand the categories that it explains, well, then you can approach it more with a spirit of study in relation to justice. And also you can use it, I think, as a kind of, when you're trying to help people, like so many people get involved in these things ultimately because they do the first bad thing is not so bad, right? It's like my friend who was a politician, his first day as county commissioner, the owner of a construction company comes in and puts a $10,000 envelope on the desk. And you could say to yourself, well, that's not so bad to take that. But if you take that one, you got to take all the other ones. So I think these things can be, if you understand them, they can become morality tales. And so I think if they spur us on to study, then I think it's good. If we get into them in a kind of sensationalist approach, that obviously then it's just manipulating our emotions,
Right.
and we got to be careful.
Very good.
I think we should break up because I actually have to go to bed. Well, because I got to get up at 5 to drive up to Wisconsin tomorrow morning. But by the way, just one small thing. So Midtown has just kind of taken over this area. And as you notice, we have a long, narrow living room here. But we're actually contemplating if we might be like trying to raise money to get rid of this wall.
This wall here?
Yeah, because I think we can get rid of this wall, and therefore we can make a much bigger living room. So that might be coming down the pipe in the next 6 months or so. Just FYI. So if the crowd gets bigger, we also might have a bigger living room. And if anybody has a spare 15 grand or or wants to run a paintbrush at some point, anyway, but just FYI. Good. We can go to the kitchenette now and